You do this thing where you lie in bed at night and replay a conversation you had 6 hours ago. Not even a bad conversation, just a normal one. But you keep going back to the thing you said, the way you said it, the look on their face when you said it. You rearrange the words. You try out better versions. You imagine what they probably thought about you after you left. And the version you imagine is never kind. You do this for 45 minutes, sometimes longer. And the strange part is, you know it's pointless. You know that this conversation is over, that the other person has almost certainly not thought about it once since it happened. You know this, and yet your brain keeps circling, keeps pulling you back, keeps insisting there's something here you haven't figured out yet. Or maybe it shows up differently for you. Maybe it's the email you rewrote 11 times before sending. Maybe it's the job you almost applied for but didn't because you couldn't decide if you were qualified enough, or if the timing was right, or if you really wanted it, or if wanting it meant you were being ungrateful for what you already have. Maybe it's the restaurant menu. Maybe it's the text message you analyzed for 20 minutes because it ended with a period instead of an exclamation point. You are not dramatic. You are not broken. You are not crazy. But you are exhausted in a way that nobody around you seems to fully understand, because the exhaustion doesn't come from what you do. It comes from what you think about doing, think about having done, and think about thinking about. You are an overthinker, and somewhere underneath the constant analysis, the mental rehearsal, the compulsive weighing of every angle, there is a question you have been circling for years without ever quite landing on it. The question is not, how do I stop overthinking? You've Googled that. You've tried the breathing exercises. You've told yourself to just let it go, and then spent 20 minutes overthinking about why you can't let it go. The real question, the one your brain keeps dancing around, is this: what am I so afraid will happen if I stop? Because here's what nobody talks about. Overthinking is not a glitch. It is not a malfunction. It is not even, strictly speaking, a bad habit. It is a survival strategy, one that was built for a very good reason, at a time in your life when it may have been the smartest thing your nervous system could have done. The problem is not that you learned to think this way. The problem is that you never got the signal that it was safe to stop. And so you keep going, thinking, analyzing, preparing for dangers that no longer exist, running mental simulations of conversations that haven't happened, building contingency plans for catastrophes that will almost certainly never arrive. You do all of this instead of living, not because you're lazy or scared or incapable of action, but because somewhere deep in the wiring of your brain and body, thinking became a substitute for living. And it happened so early and so completely that you can't always tell the difference anymore. 73% of adults between 25 and 35 engage in chronic overthinking, but that number drops to 20% for people over 60, which means this is not who you are. It is something you learned, and anything you learned, your brain can unlearn. But before we get to that, we need to understand something first. We need to understand what overthinking actually is, where it lives in the brain, why it feels so productive even when it isn't, and most importantly, how it started. Because this didn't come from nowhere, and the story of where it came from is probably the most important part of all of this. Let's start with what psychologists actually mean when they use the word rumination, because it's more specific than you might think. There are 3 kinds of repetitive thought, and only 2 of them are problems. The first is rumination. Rumination is past-focused, passive, and self-critical. It's, why did I say that? What's wrong with me? Why do I always do this? The second is worry. Worry is future-focused and catastrophic. It's what if this goes wrong? What if they leave? What if I'm not good enough? The third is productive thinking. Productive thinking asks concrete, answerable questions. How specifically did this go wrong? What can I do about it? What's my next step? Productive thinking actually arrives somewhere. Rumination and worry just keep going in circles. A Yale psychologist named Susan Nolen-Hoeksema spent her career studying why some people get stuck in those circles, while others don't. Her response styles theory, published in 1991, proposed something that sounds obvious but had never been rigorously demonstrated. People who respond to sadness by focusing on their symptoms, their causes, and their consequences experience longer, more severe depressive episodes than people who distract themselves with absorbing activities. She wasn't saying distraction is always the answer. She was saying that the thing overthinkers do instinctively, the thing that feels like processing, is actually making them worse. Her research confirmed it. Across decades, rumination exacerbates depression. It enhances negative thinking. It impairs problem solving. It interferes with the ability to take action. And it erodes social support. Because eventually, the people around you get tired of listening to the same loops. But here's the finding that matters most for understanding what overthinking really does to a life. Nolen-Hoeksema found that rumination doesn't just prolong depression, it predicts the onset of new depressive episodes. It is a cause, not merely a symptom. The thinking itself is making you sick. Not all rumination is the same though. Researchers identified 2 subtypes, and the difference between them is everything. The first is brooding. Brooding is passive, judgmental self-comparison. Why do I have problems other people don't? What did I do to deserve this? Brooding predicted increases in depression over the course of a year. The second subtype is reflective pondering, which is a purposeful attempt to understand your own mood. Reflective pondering actually predicted decreases in depression. The tragedy is that when overthinkers sit with their thoughts, believing they're working through something, the vast majority of what they're doing is brooding, not reflecting. They feel like they're processing. They're actually marinating. Edward Watkins at the University of Exeter found that the entire difference often comes down to a single word: why versus how. Abstract rumination asks why. Why am I such a failure? Why does this always happen to me? Why can't I just be normal? Concrete processing asks how. How specifically did this go wrong? How did I contribute? How could I handle it differently next time? In a study of 80 participants, Watkins found that simply shifting depressed patients from abstract self-focus to concrete self-focus significantly improved their problem-solving ability. Same people, same problems, different question, different result. And this pattern doesn't just show up in emotional processing. It shows up in decisions. Barry Schwartz studied what he called maximizers, people who compulsively seek the best possible option for every choice, versus satisficers, people who establish a threshold and choose the first option that meets it. Maximizers scored dramatically higher on depression and regret. They spent more time comparing, more time second-guessing, more time ruminating after choosing. And here's the part that should bother you if you're an overthinker. In a study tracking college students through their job searches, maximizers secured positions with 20% higher starting salaries than satisficers. They objectively won, but they were less satisfied with their outcomes and experienced more negative emotion. They got the better result and felt worse about it. They won the game, but couldn't enjoy the victory. The famous jam study made this concrete. When researchers offered shoppers 6 varieties of jam, 30% bought 1. When they offered 24 varieties, only 3% did, 10 times more likely to actually choose when there was less to overthink about. More options didn't create more freedom. More options created more paralysis. So overthinking is not just a mood problem. It is a thinking style that actively degrades your ability to solve problems, make decisions, and experience satisfaction with the choices you do make. It masquerades as thoroughness. It feels like responsibility, and it produces absolutely nothing except more of itself. But here's where it gets more complicated. Because if overthinking is so clearly destructive, if the research is this unanimous, then why can't you just stop? Why does knowing all of this not change anything? The answer is in your brain, and it's more interesting than you'd expect. Your brain has a storytelling network. It activates whenever you stop focusing on the external world, whenever there's no task demanding your attention, whenever you're just sitting there existing. A neurologist named Marcus Reichel at Washington University discovered it in 2001 and named it the default mode network. It's made up of several interconnected brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. And it does some remarkable things. It constructs your sense of self. It replays memories. It imagines possible futures. It runs social simulations, trying to predict how other people think and feel. When this network is functioning well, it weaves a coherent internal narrative. It's the voice in your head that makes you feel like a continuous person moving through time. In chronic overthinkers, this network gets hijacked. A meta-analysis of 14 brain imaging studies found that rumination correlates specifically with hyperconnectivity in the default mode network's core regions. The network that's supposed to construct a stable sense of self instead becomes an engine of self-attack. It replays failures on a loop. It constructs worst-case scenarios with cinematic detail. It takes ambiguous social information and fills in the gaps with the cruelest possible interpretation. And it does all of this automatically, below the threshold of conscious choice, so that by the time you're aware you're ruminating, you've already been at it for minutes. There's a feedback loop that makes this worse. Greg Siegel, a neuroscientist, ran brain scans on people while showing them emotionally negative images. In healthy subjects, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, fired in response and then settled back down within about 10 seconds. In depressed subjects, it kept firing for 25 seconds or longer, and the duration of that amygdala response correlated directly with self-reported rumination. The alarm goes off and stays off. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to function as the brain's regulatory brake, either fails to engage or gets recruited into the rumination itself, constructing elaborate narratives about why the alarm is justified. The brake and the accelerator become decoupled. The alarm screams, and the narrator spins stories to explain the screaming. And the stories trigger more alarm, and the cycle feeds itself. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable, observable, neural activity. And the cruelest part of all of it is this. Rumination creates the subjective feeling of insight while actively destroying the capacity for it. Researchers induced rumination in people who were already feeling down and then asked them whether they felt they were gaining useful understanding. They said yes. They genuinely believed the rumination was helping, but at the same time, they became less willing to engage in activities that would actually improve their mood, more pessimistic about their futures, and worse, at solving interpersonal problems than any other group in the study. The most revealing detail came in a follow-up. Researchers found that ruminators could identify perfectly good solutions to their problems. The solutions were right there. The ruminators saw them clearly, but they showed dramatically reduced likelihood of implementing any of them. They could think their way to the answer and then think their way right past it. Distraction, on the other hand, worked. Dysphoric participants who were simply given an absorbing task to focus on performed just as well as people who weren't depressed at all. The problem was never sadness. The problem was what rumination does to sadness. It takes a passing weather system and turns it into a permanent climate. Your brain, in other words, is lying to you. It's telling you that this loop, this analysis, this one more time around the thought is getting you somewhere. It's not. It's a neural slot machine that pays out just enough pseudo-insight to keep you pulling the lever. And every pull strengthens the circuitry that makes the next pull more likely. But understanding the brain only explains the mechanism. It doesn't explain the origin. And the origin is where the real story lives, because your default mode network didn't hijack itself. Something taught it to work this way. And that something, for most chronic overthinkers, happened before they were old enough to understand what was happening. Imagine a child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, sitting in a living room. The house is quiet, but it's the wrong kind of quiet. It's the kind of quiet that means something is about to happen. Maybe a parent is in the other room, and their mood could go either way. Maybe there was a fight last night, and the residue is still hanging in the air. This child has learned through hundreds of small experiences that the emotional temperature of the house can shift without warning. So they watch, they listen, they scan facial expressions and body language and tone of voice, looking for micro signals that would tell them which version of a parent they're about to get. They learn to read a room the way a sailor reads the sky, because getting it wrong has consequences. Maybe the consequences are yelling. Maybe they're withdrawal. Maybe there's something worse. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this child's brain, in its extraordinary adaptive intelligence, develops a full-time monitoring system that runs in the background at all times. It becomes automatic. It becomes invisible. It becomes the operating system. That is where overthinking begins. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who developed attachment theory, described something he called internal working models. These are cognitive emotional templates built through early interactions with caregivers that shape how a person expects relationships to work. A child whose caregiver was consistently responsive develops a positive model of self and a trusting model of others. A child whose caregiver was inconsistently responsive, sometimes there and sometimes not, sometimes warm and sometimes cold, develops something very different. They develop a negative model of self that says, I'm not worthy of reliable care, and a hypervigilant model of others that says, people might disappear at any moment, so I need to watch constantly. Mary Ainsworth tested this in her strange situation experiments in the 1970s. She observed how infants behaved when briefly separated from their mothers and then reunited. Some children, about 60%, used their mother as a secure base, explored confidently, got upset at separation, and recovered quickly upon reunion. But about 10 to 15% showed a pattern she called anxious ambivalent attachment. These children were the direct developmental precursors to adult overthinkers. They monitored their caregivers intensely. They failed to explore the environment around them because their attention was locked onto the parent. They showed distress even before the separation happened, as if they were already anticipating the loss. And when the parent returned, they clung but couldn't be comforted. They wanted closeness but couldn't relax into it. That pattern, that wanting but not trusting, that reaching but not resting, that is the attachment signature that becomes adult overthinking in relationships. It's the person who replays conversations, analyzes text messages, scans for signs of withdrawal, and cannot stop constructing narratives about what their partner is really thinking. Later research confirmed that rumination partially mediates the connection between attachment anxiety and depressive symptoms. The anxious attachment style doesn't just make relationships harder, it makes your own mind harder to live in. But attachment is only one pathway. There's another that's just as common, and in some ways, more devastating. Gregory Jerkovich, in his 1997 book, Lost Childhoods, described a phenomenon called parentification. It happens when the parent-child relationship gets inverted, when the child becomes the caretaker. Instrumental parentification means the child takes over practical tasks, cooking, cleaning, caring for younger siblings. Emotional parentification means the child becomes a parent's confidant, therapist, mediator. The emotionally parentified child must constantly monitor adult emotions, anticipate needs, and manage a relational system they were never designed to manage. This chronic anticipatory analysis wires the developing brain for exactly one thing: overthinking. The child learns that safety depends on prediction, and prediction requires constant cognitive vigilance. A meta-analysis linked parentification to personality disorders, anxiety, elevated cortisol, and persistent hypervigilance that continues long after the child leaves home. Pete Walker, a psychotherapist who works with complex trauma, mapped out 4 survival responses that develop in these environments: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. 2 of them are especially relevant here. The freeze type retreats into solitude and mental spinning. Walker describes them as people whose starter button is stuck in the off position. They are paralyzed in their bodies, but racing in their minds. They can think about doing things. They can plan endlessly, but they cannot begin. The fawn type overwrites their own needs with constant analysis of what others want and need. They become so skilled at reading rooms and anticipating expectations that they lose track of their own desires entirely. Walker describes the flight-freeze hybrid as perhaps the most overthinking combination of all. Obsessive planning fused with dissociative withdrawal, the mind generating contingency after contingency, while the body stays perfectly still. And here is the part that matters most, the part that will probably land differently if you recognize yourself in any of this. In certain family systems, expressing emotions brought punishment. Maybe you were told to stop crying. Maybe showing anger got you hit. Maybe vulnerability was met with dismissal or mockery. In those environments, the child quickly learned that feelings were dangerous and taking action was dangerous because the consequences were unpredictable. So the child retreated to the only safe domain, thinking. You could think all you wanted and nobody could punish you for it. You could analyze, plan, and predict without ever revealing yourself or risking the wrong move. Thinking became the refuge, the one place where the world felt controllable, where outcomes could be managed, where danger could theoretically be anticipated and avoided. The clinical term for this is intellectualization, and the American Psychological Association defines it as dealing with emotional conflicts through excessive intellectual activity. But that clinical language misses the emotional truth of it. A more honest way to say it would be this: your mind essentially decided at a very young age that feelings are big and scary, so let's turn them into thoughts instead. And that decision was not pathology. It was not a weakness. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated survival system, created by a brain that was doing the absolute best it could with the information and resources available to it. The problem is not that you learned this. The problem is that the context changed and the strategy didn't. You grew up, you left the house, the unpredictable parent is no longer in the next room, but the monitoring system is still running. The hypervigilance is still scanning for threats that aren't there anymore. The thinking instead of feeling strategy is still in place, burning cognitive fuel 24 hours a day, analyzing situations that don't require analysis, preparing for emergencies that will never arrive. And now it doesn't feel like a survival strategy at all. It just feels like who you are. It isn't. But we'll come back to that. First, you need to see what this pattern looks like when it's had 20 or 30 years to spread into every corner of a life. Because the damage of overthinking is not dramatic. It is not spectacular. It is quiet, cumulative, and deeply personal. And it shows up in places you might not expect. Start with the small stuff, because the small stuff is where it's most visible. You stand in the grocery store, staring at 2 brands of olive oil. You know they're essentially the same. You know this decision does not matter. And yet you pick up both bottles, compare labels, check prices per ounce, wonder if the Italian one is actually from Italy, and then stand there for another 90 seconds, feeling vaguely anxious about something that a different version of you would have resolved in 5 seconds by grabbing the one on the left and moving on. Multiply this by every decision you make in a day. What to eat, what to wear, which route to take, how to word a text, whether to respond now or later, and you begin to understand why you're tired by noon without having done anything particularly strenuous. A study of adults with attention difficulties found that 58% experienced decision paralysis at least weekly, and 74% reported that indecision contributed to missed opportunities. But this isn't just about people with clinical diagnoses. This is about everyone whose brain has been trained to treat every choice as a potential catastrophe, every fork in the road as a test with consequences that cannot be taken back. Now scale it up. Career decisions. You know you're unhappy in your job, or at least you think you know, but you're not sure if you're really unhappy or if you're just going through a phase. And even if you are unhappy, is it bad enough to justify leaving? What if the next thing is worse? What if you leave and regret it? What if you stay and regret that? You could make a pros and cons list, and you do, and then you make another one. And then you spend 2 hours researching what other people who left similar jobs experienced. And then you decide you need more information before you can decide. And so you decide to decide later, which is itself a decision, though it doesn't feel like one. It feels like nothing happened. But what happened is that another 6 months went by. Relationships. You met someone. They seem great. But do they seem too great? Is this real? Or are you just excited because they're new? Are they actually interested? Or are they just being polite? You replay the last date in your head, analyzing every sentence, every pause, every moment of eye contact or lack thereof. You draft a text and then delete it. You draft another one and then stare at it for 15 minutes. You ask a friend what they think and then overthink your friend's response. And underneath all of this analysis is a question you can't quite reach, which is not, do they like me? But, is it safe to want this? Research has confirmed the connection. Attachment anxiety, the hypervigilant monitoring style that develops from inconsistent early caregiving, directly predicts relationship overthinking. People with anxious attachment seek reassurance compulsively, and one study found that intolerance of uncertainty mediates the link between attachment anxiety and worry, which means the overthinking isn't really about the relationship. It's about the inability to tolerate not knowing. And relationships, by their nature, always involve not knowing. Creativity. This is where the cost of overthinking becomes almost tragic, because creative work requires the exact opposite of what overthinking does. A psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called flow, the state of complete absorption where self-consciousness disappears and time distorts, and the work just moves through you. Flow requires something neuroscientists call transient hypofrontality, which is a fancy way of saying the prefrontal cortex temporarily quiets down. The self-monitoring part of the brain goes offline. Different brain regions start communicating freely without the usual editorial oversight. That's where creative breakthroughs live. Overthinking is the direct antithesis of flow. It cranks the prefrontal cortex up to maximum volume and keeps it there. The editor never leaves the room. Every idea gets evaluated before it's fully formed. Every impulse gets second-guessed before it can become action. Sian Baylock's research on choking under pressure proved this empirically. Expert golfers who had automated their swings through thousands of hours of practice performed worse when they were asked to consciously monitor each step of their swing. Conscious oversight degraded the performance that unconscious expertise had perfected. Trying too hard made them worse. Thinking too much broke what not thinking had built. If you've ever sat in front of a blank page or a blank canvas or a blank anything and felt the weight of all the possible things you could do pressing down on you until you couldn't do any of them, this is the mechanism. It's not a lack of talent. It's not a lack of ideas. It's a prefrontal cortex that refuses to step back and let the work happen. And then there's perfectionism, which is overthinking wearing a suit and pretending to be a virtue. Thomas Curran and Andrew Hill published a meta-analysis in 2019 that tracked over 41,000 college students across 27 years, from 1989 to 2016. All three dimensions of perfectionism had increased over that period. Self-oriented perfectionism, the pressure you put on yourself, went up by 10%. Other-oriented perfectionism, the standards you impose on people around you, went up by 16%. And socially prescribed perfectionism, the feeling that others expect perfection from you, went up by 33%. A third of a generation's worth of increased pressure to be flawless, and that pressure manifests as endless mental review. Was that good enough? Could it have been better? What will they think? The perfectionist doesn't just want to do well. They need to do perfectly. And since perfection doesn't exist, they are permanently stuck in a loop of evaluation and re-evaluation that never reaches a satisfying conclusion. Timothy Peichel at Carleton University connected the dots between overthinking, perfectionism, and procrastination. His core finding rewrites everything most people believe about procrastination. It is not a time management problem. It is an emotion regulation problem. The mechanism works like this. You think about a task. The thinking amplifies your negative feelings about it, the difficulty, the possibility of failure, the imagined judgment. Those amplified feelings trigger avoidance. The avoidance provides temporary relief, which feels like it was the right move. But then guilt arrives, and time pressure builds, and both of those fuel more overthinking about the task you're now further behind on. You didn't procrastinate because you're lazy. You procrastinated because your brain used overthinking to magnify the emotional threat of the task until avoidance felt like the only rational response. A Harvard study from 2010 put a number on the scope of this, researchers contacted thousands of people at random moments throughout their day and asked 3 questions. What are you doing? What are you thinking about? How happy are you? They found that minds wander between 30 and 50% of waking hours, and across virtually every activity, from commuting to working to eating to having a conversation. People were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were paying attention to what they were actually doing. The activity itself mattered less than whether you were present for it. You could be doing something boring and feel okay, or doing something enjoyable and feel miserable, depending entirely on whether your mind was there or somewhere else. For the chronic overthinker, whose mind is somewhere else the majority of the time, this finding carries a specific kind of weight. The overthinking is not just stealing your peace of mind. It is stealing your ability to experience the life that's happening around you, while you're busy analyzing a life that exists only in your head. And beneath all of this, running quietly underneath every cancelled plan, every unsent application, every relationship that never quite started, every creative project that lives only in your head, there is the existential cost that the psychotherapist Irvin Yalom named with devastating precision. The more unlived your life, he wrote, the greater your death anxiety. The more you fail to experience your life fully, the more you will fear death. Yalom observed patients who tried to dodge death by refusing to live, as if staying still made you a smaller target. Overthinking was one of the primary mechanisms. By never committing, never risking, never being fully present, the overthinker avoids the vulnerability of genuine engagement, but they also miss the thing that makes the vulnerability worthwhile. There's a term for this gap between how overthinkers appear from the outside and how they feel on the inside. You could call it the performance experience gap. From the outside, many chronic overthinkers look fine, more than fine. They hold down careers, they maintain relationships, they manage responsibilities, they appear competent, reliable, even impressive, but internally they experience chronic mental exhaustion, an inability to absorb positive experiences, and a persistent sense of being stuck despite outward motion. Gay Hendricks describes this as being trapped in the zone of excellence, performing well at things you're good at, but never making the leap to your zone of genius, because overthinking generates a wall of fear at every threshold of growth. You're not stuck because you can't move. You're stuck because every time you approach the edge of something new, the monitoring system kicks in and floods you with reasons not to jump. And those reasons feel so convincing, so logical, so well-reasoned, that you mistake them for wisdom. They're not wisdom. They're a fire alarm going off in a building that isn't burning. But the alarm is so loud that you can't tell the difference. Which brings us to the part that makes this whole pattern so maddeningly resistant to change. The part where overthinking protects itself. Adrian Wells is a professor at the University of Manchester who has spent his career studying something most therapists overlook entirely. Not the content of people's thoughts, but what people believe about their thoughts. He calls it metacognition, thinking about thinking, and his research uncovered the engine that keeps overthinking running long after it should have burned itself out. Wells developed a model called the cognitive attentional syndrome, and it identifies a pattern that every chronic overthinker will recognize. It goes like this. You worry, you ruminate, you monitor for threats, you try to control your thoughts, and you do all of this because at some level you believe it's helping. You believe that worrying prepares you, that analyzing protects you, that going over something one more time will reveal the answer you haven't found yet. These are what Wells calls positive metacognitive beliefs, and they are the reason you can't stop. His research found something extraordinary. 100% of patients with recurrent major depression held positive beliefs about rumination. Every single one. They genuinely believed, that their rumination was serving a purpose. If I think about this enough, I'll understand it. Worrying shows I care. If I stop analyzing, I'll be caught off guard. The beliefs are invisible because they feel like common sense. Of course, you should think things through. Of course, preparation matters. Of course, being careful is better than being reckless. The beliefs hide inside values that sound healthy, and so the person never questions whether the thinking has crossed the line from useful to destructive. A large meta-analysis confirmed the numbers. Positive beliefs about rumination correlated at 0.50 with rumination itself and 0.27 with depression. In plain language, the more you believe thinking is helping, the more you think, and the more depressed you become. But there's a second layer. In addition to positive beliefs, overthinkers develop negative beliefs about their own thinking. I can't control my thoughts. This worrying is going to damage my health. Something is wrong with my brain. These meta-worries, worry about worrying, create a second cycle on top of the first. You ruminate because you believe it helps, and then you worry about the rumination because you believe you've lost control. The two layers feed each other, and the person gets trapped between them. Wells's metacognitive therapy targets these beliefs directly, and the clinical results are striking. 80% of patients were classified as recovered at the end of treatment, and 70% maintained recovery at 12 months. Those are remarkable numbers for any psychological intervention. They suggest that for many chronic overthinkers, the problem is not the thoughts themselves, but the relationship to the thoughts, the belief that the thinking is necessary, the conviction that stopping would be dangerous. This maps onto something Helen Langer identified decades ago, the illusion of control. Your brain treats analysis as action. When you think through a problem, your mind generates a subjective sense of agency, a feeling of preparedness, a belief that you're doing something useful, but you're not doing anything. You're running a simulation, and the simulation produces dopamine, the same neurochemical associated with anticipation and reward, which makes the simulation feel productive, which makes you run it again. Jeffrey Schwartz's research on obsessive-compulsive disorder found that rumination activates the same neural circuits, the orbitofrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the caudate nucleus, involved in genuine planning and problem-solving. Your brain literally cannot distinguish between productive analysis and recursive rumination at the circuit level. They use the same hardware, which means every engagement with the rumination strengthens the pathways that produce more rumination. It is, neurologically, a habit. And there's one more dimension that makes the trap complete. Gay Hendricks, in his book The Big Leap, described what he called the upper limit problem, and it explains something overthinkers find genuinely confusing about themselves. The overthinking doesn't just happen when things go wrong. It often intensifies when things go well. You get a promotion and immediately start worrying about whether you can handle it. You start a relationship that feels right, and your brain floods you with reasons it might fall apart. You have a creative breakthrough, and then spend the next 3 days questioning whether it was actually any good. Hendricks proposes that each person has an internal thermostat for how much love, success, and creativity they can tolerate. When positive experiences exceed that set point, the mind generates catastrophic what-ifs, self-criticism, or guilt to pull feelings back down to a familiar baseline. He wrote, "Each of us has an inner thermostat setting that determines how much love, success, and creativity we allow ourselves to enjoy. When we exceed our inner thermostat setting, we will often do something to sabotage ourselves. Worry is the primary tool. Overthinking is how the thermostat resets." So now the picture is complete. The overthinker learned to think instead of feel as a child. The brain's default mode network encoded this pattern into automatic neural circuitry. The hijacked amygdala prefrontal loop keeps the alarm ringing while the narrative engine spins stories to justify it. Positive metacognitive beliefs convince the overthinker that the thinking is necessary. The illusion of control makes it feel productive, and the upper limit problem ensures that even success triggers more of the same. It is, in every sense, a self-sustaining system, a machine designed to keep running. But there's one more piece of this picture that tends to get overlooked, even by therapists, and it lives not in the mind at all, but in the body. You probably don't think of overthinking as a body problem. It feels like it lives entirely in your head. But Stephen Porges, the neuroscientist who developed polyvagal theory, would tell you that you're wrong about that. And once you understand why, the whole pattern starts to look different. Porges described 3 circuits in the autonomic nervous system, each associated with a different survival state. The newest one, the ventral vagal system, governs social engagement and the feeling of safety. When this system is online, you can think clearly, connect with others, and tolerate uncertainty. The sympathetic system governs fight or flight. It mobilizes you for action, pumping adrenaline, quickening your heart rate, sharpening your attention. The oldest system, the dorsal vagal, governs freeze and shut down. It's the last resort, the one that takes over when fight and flight have failed, and it pulls you into immobility, conservation, and disconnection. Now here's where overthinking lives in this model. When the sympathetic system mobilizes you for action, but the action can't be completed because the threat is social, because fighting would make it worse, because there's nothing to physically flee from. The undischarged energy has to go somewhere. It channels into cognitive loops. The mind runs because the legs can't. And when the dorsal vagal freeze response takes over, something even stranger happens. The body collapses into stillness and low energy, while the mind accelerates into frantic analysis. You feel exhausted, you can barely get off the couch, but your thoughts are going 100 miles an hour. That paradox, that dead body with a racing mind, is the freeze response. And it's one of the most common experiences overthinkers describe without ever knowing what it is. This is why overthinking can feel so physically draining even though you haven't moved. Your body is in energy conservation mode. Your nervous system is behaving as though you are in danger. And the thinking, the relentless analyzing, is the nervous system's attempt to resolve the danger cognitively because it has already determined, unconsciously, that physical action isn't an option. Bessel van der Kolk, the trauma researcher, described what this looks like from the inside. In brain scans of people with chronic post-traumatic stress, he found almost no activation in the brain's self-sensing areas compared to non-traumatized subjects. The body had gone offline. These people could think about themselves endlessly, but could not feel themselves. Van der Kolk named a condition called alexithymia, which literally means no words for feelings. People with alexithymia experience physical discomfort, but cannot describe what the problem is. They are disconnected from the internal signals that would tell them they are hungry, tired, afraid, or angry. And in the absence of reliable body signals, the brain compensates by generating more thoughts, more analysis, more narrative, because that's the only channel still open. Peter Levine, the developer of somatic experiencing, provided the missing piece. Animals in the wild, when they survive a life-threatening event, discharge the survival energy almost immediately. They shake, they tremble, they complete the defensive movements their bodies started during the threat, running or fighting or collapsing, and then recovering. Once the discharge is complete, they return to normal. They don't develop chronic trauma. Humans, with our powerful thinking brains, can override this natural discharge process. We can suppress the shaking, we can hold still, we can intellectualize the experience instead of physically completing it. Levine's formulation is one of the most important sentences in trauma research. Trauma is a highly activated, incomplete biological response to threat, frozen in time. The energy that was mobilized for survival never got used, and so it sits there in the body, cycling, seeking resolution. When it can't find resolution through the body, it finds it through the mind. Cognitive loops become the nervous system's way of continuing to process a physical event that was never physically completed. Research on interoception, the ability to sense internal body states, confirmed this connection. In a study that deserves more attention than it gets, researchers found that the combination of high brooding rumination and low interoceptive awareness was associated with the highest levels of depression and anxiety. The less connected you are to your body's signals, the more your mind tries to fill in the gaps. And the mind, left to its own devices, tends to fill those gaps with worry. The cycle perpetuates itself. Stress activates the nervous system. The person retreats into cognition to cope. Body signals get ignored. The dysregulation worsens because it's not being addressed at the source. The worsening dysregulation generates more distress. More distress fuels more thinking. And the person moves further and further from the body that could actually tell them what they need. This is why thinking about overthinking doesn't fix overthinking. The solution isn't cognitive. It never was. The solution is about changing the physiological state that produces the thoughts in the first place, which brings us, finally, to what actually works. The most counterintuitive finding in the treatment of depression and rumination came from a study that almost nobody expected to produce the results it did. In 1996, a researcher named Neil Jacobson took apart cognitive behavioral therapy to figure out which pieces actually worked. He took 150 outpatients with major depression and randomly assigned them to one of three conditions. The first group got behavioral activation alone, which basically means getting people to do things, to engage with activities, to approach rather than avoid. The second group got behavioral activation plus cognitive restructuring, which adds the thought-changing techniques most people associate with therapy. The third group got the full CBT package, everything included. Everyone expected the full package to win. It didn't. Behavioral activation alone was just as effective as the complete treatment, and the results held for 2 years. A follow-up study replicated and extended this, showing that behavioral activation was comparable to antidepressant medication and potentially superior to cognitive therapy for people with severe depression. Sit with that for a second. For overthinkers, the most effective intervention was not learning to think differently. It was learning to do things anyway, to re-engage with life, to approach what you've been avoiding, to take action before the analysis is complete. Doing things, it turns out, breaks the rumination cycle more effectively than trying to change the rumination itself. Not because the thoughts don't matter, but because the behavioral loop is the entry point the brain actually responds to. You can argue with a thought endlessly. You can't argue with a walk around the block. This doesn't mean that thought-based interventions are useless. Two of them are particularly effective for overthinking, and both of them work not by changing what you think, but by changing your relationship to the thinking. The first is acceptance and commitment therapy, developed by Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada. Hayes introduced a concept called cognitive diffusion, which means learning to see your thoughts as passing mental events rather than truths that require a response. You don't argue with the thought. You don't analyze it. You don't try to replace it with a better thought. You just notice it. I am having the thought that I will fail. Not, I will fail. I am having the thought that I will fail. That small grammatical shift creates distance between you and the thought, enough distance to choose whether to act on it. Hayes and his colleagues tested specific diffusion techniques and found results that sound almost too simple to be real. One technique involved taking a distressing word, something like failure or worthless, and repeating it out loud rapidly for 30 seconds until it became just a sound, just noise, the meaning drained out of it. In controlled experiments, this reduced both the discomfort and the believability of negative self-referential thoughts more effectively than either distraction or attempts at thought control. The thought didn't go away. It just stopped meaning what it used to mean. As Hayes put it, the goal is not to change the content of your thoughts, but to change your relationship to them. The second intervention is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, developed by Zindel Segal, Mark Williams, and John Teasdale specifically to prevent depression relapse. In their research, they found that for people with 3 or more prior depressive episodes, MBCT reduced the relapse rate from 78% to 36%. It roughly halved the risk of falling back into depression. The mechanism is what the researchers call decentering, learning to relate to your thoughts as weather passing through, rather than identifying with them as truth. They distinguish between what they call doing mode and being mode. Doing mode is goal-directed. It monitors the gap between where you are and where you want to be. It generates plans to close that gap. And when the gap involves your own emotional state, when you notice that you feel bad and you want to feel good, doing mode applies the same problem-solving machinery to your feelings that you would apply to a broken dishwasher. It tries to fix you. And the attempt to fix your emotional state through thinking is rumination. Being mode is different. It's present moment, non-judgmental, observational. It doesn't try to close any gap. It just notices what is. Thoughts arise and pass. Feelings arise and pass. Sensations arise and pass. Nothing needs to be fixed because nothing is being evaluated against a standard. And in this mode, the default mode network quiets down. Brain imaging studies showed that experienced meditators had fundamentally different default mode network activity, reduced activation during meditation, and stronger connections between the DMN and cognitive control regions. The rumination network was still there. It just wasn't running the show anymore. But here's the thing about both of these approaches. They are not one-time fixes. They are practices. And for the chronic overthinker, the idea of just practicing can itself become a source of overthinking. Am I doing it right? Am I mindful enough? Am I diffusing correctly? So let me offer 2 more practical frames that cut through the cognitive noise. The first comes from Herbert Simon, a man who won both the Nobel Prize in Economics and the Turing Award, which is essentially the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. Simon coined the term satisficing around 1956. Satisficing means establishing a threshold of acceptability and choosing the first option that meets it, instead of exhaustively searching for the best possible option. His insight was both mathematical and deeply human. The cost of searching for the perfect solution almost always outweighs the marginal benefit of finding it compared to a good enough one. The capacity of the human mind for formulating and solving complex problems is very small compared with the size of the problems whose solution is required for objectively rational behavior in the real world. In other words, the overthinking isn't helping because it can't help. Your brain is not powerful enough to calculate the optimal choice in most real-world situations, and trying to do so produces worse outcomes than simply picking something reasonable and moving on. Satisficing is not settling. It's not lowering your standards. It is the most rational possible response to a world with too many variables. It is how every successful person you admire actually makes decisions, whether they know the word for it or not. The question is not, what's the best option? The question is, what's good enough to move forward with? And if the answer to that question makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is exactly the thing that needs to be tolerated, not analyzed. The second frame comes from exposure research. A study randomized 71 students with elevated perfectionism into two groups. One group did an exposure-based task where they were asked to deliberately make mistakes and sit with the discomfort. The other group was a waitlist control. The exposure group showed decreased perfectionism, lower depression, and lower social anxiety. Not because they learned to think differently about mistakes, because they made mistakes and discovered through direct experience that they survived. The body learned what the mind could not teach. And this is the deepest truth about breaking the overthinking loop. You cannot think your way out of it. You have to act your way out. You have to do the thing before you feel ready. Send the email before it's perfect. Take the step before you've analyzed every possible outcome. Not because thinking doesn't matter, but because the overthinking itself is a form of avoidance. It looks like engagement. It feels like preparation, but it's a sophisticated way of staying still while appearing to move. Dan Siegel, the neuroscientist, offers the most compassionate frame for this process. He describes a window of tolerance, an optimal zone of arousal, where a person can think clearly, feel emotions, and respond to stress without falling apart. Above this window is hyperarousal, racing thoughts, catastrophizing, panic, which is where most overthinkers spend their mental lives. Below it is hypoarousal, numbness, dissociation, brain fog, the collapse that happens when overthinking exhausts the system. Trauma and childhood adversity narrow this window. Therapy, body-based practices, and mindfulness widen it. The goal is not to eliminate difficult thoughts. It never was. The goal is to expand your capacity to tolerate uncertainty, discomfort, and imperfection without retreating into the old survival strategy. To stay in the window while the storm passes, instead of climbing into the attic of your mind and pulling up the ladder. So let's go back to the beginning. You're lying in bed at night, replaying that conversation. Your brain is telling you there's something there you missed, something you need to figure out. And now you know what's actually happening. You know the default mode network has fired up and locked onto a negative stimulus. You know the amygdala responded, and the prefrontal cortex, instead of calming it down, got recruited into building the narrative. You know your nervous system has slipped into either sympathetic mobilization or dorsal vagal freeze, which is why your body feels tense or heavy or both. You know that the feeling of almost getting it, the feeling that the answer is just one more thought away, is the illusion of insight that Lyubomirsky documented. The slot machine paying out just enough to keep you playing. You know all of this, and the conversation is still playing on a loop. This is the point where most self-help content would pivot to a tidy resolution. 5 steps to stop overthinking. 3 techniques to quiet your mind. The journaling practice that will change your life. And I'm not going to do that, because if you're actually an overthinker, you've tried those things. You've tried them, analyzed why they didn't work, and then overthought about why you couldn't stick with them. Giving you more things to think about is not the solution to thinking too much. Instead, I want to tell you something that I think matters more than any technique. The child who learned to think instead of feel, who built a watchtower in their mind and staffed it 24 hours a day, who turned every emotion into a problem to be solved and every silence into a threat to be analyzed. That child was doing something remarkable. They were surviving. They took an impossible situation, a home that was unpredictable, emotions that were unsafe, a body that was too small to fight or flee, and they found the one domain where they had some measure of control. They thought their way to safety. And it worked. It worked well enough that they're still here, still functioning, still capable of sitting somewhere right now, listening to this. That strategy deserves respect, not resentment. Your overthinking kept you alive. It kept you attentive. It kept you one step ahead in an environment where falling behind had real consequences. The fact that it now causes you pain does not erase the fact that it once served you beautifully. You are not broken for having developed this pattern. You are not weak for struggling to let it go. You are someone whose survival system is running a program that was perfectly designed for an environment you no longer live in. The alarm is real. The danger is not. And this is where the real work begins. Not in your head, but in the space between your head and everything else. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize its own wiring in response to experience, is not a theory. It is an observed, measured, and replicated phenomenon. The default mode networks of experienced meditators look fundamentally different from those of non-meditators. People who practice behavioral activation, who force themselves to act before the analysis is complete, develop stronger connections between their prefrontal cortex and their motor regions, the neural pathways of doing rather than deliberating. People who practice interoception, who slowly reconnect with their body's signals, show increased activation in the insula, the brain region that bridges body sensation and conscious awareness. The patterns that were wired in can be rewired, not overnight, not easily, but measurably, reliably, progressively. The philosopher Kierkegaard wrote in 1844 that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. He described a person standing at the edge of a cliff, experiencing 2 fears at once, the fear of falling and the deeper, more disorienting fear of their own freedom to jump. The vertigo comes not from the height, but from the awareness of infinite possibility. You could do anything. You could choose any path. You could become any version of yourself. And that freedom, for the overthinker, is the most terrifying thing in the world. Because freedom means uncertainty. And uncertainty means the monitoring system can never fully stand down. But Kierkegaard didn't stop there. He went on to say something that most people leave out of the quote. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate, not the absence of anxiety, not the elimination of uncertainty, the right relationship to it. Anxiety, he argued, was not a disease. It was a condition of being fully human, and the person who could face it, tolerate it, move through it, rather than around it, had access to something that the person who fled from it never would. That something, I think, is a fully lived life, not a life without overthinking, not a mind that's permanently quiet, not some fantasy of effortless peace where thoughts float through like clouds and you watch them pass with serene detachment. That's a poster on a therapist's wall, not a realistic goal. What is realistic is this: a life where the thoughts still come, because they will, and you notice them, and you feel the familiar pull to engage, to analyze, to rehearse, to prepare, and you choose, not perfectly, not every time, but more often than you used to do something anyway, to send the email, to start the conversation, to apply for the thing, to sit with the not knowing instead of drowning it in analysis. Irvin Yalom, the existential therapist, wrote that though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death may save us. What he meant is that confronting your finitude, genuinely reckoning with the fact that your time is limited, can liberate you from the paralysis of infinite deliberation. If you had forever, overthinking would be rational. You could afford to analyze every option. You could afford to wait until you were certain. But you don't have forever. And the cost of thinking about living is measured in the same currency as living itself: time. You are spending your time on this. Right now, right here. You are spending irreplaceable minutes of your life engaged with this story. And that engagement is a choice you made without overthinking it. A choice you made because something in these words felt true enough to keep listening. You are already capable of the thing you think you can't do. You have been doing it this entire time. The nervous system that learned to find safety in thinking can learn to find safety in experience. Not because someone convinces it with arguments, not because a book or a video or a podcast says the right words in the right order, but because, slowly, one small action at a time, the body discovers that doing something imperfect does not result in the catastrophe the mind predicted. The email gets sent and the world doesn't end. The conversation happens and it's awkward, and then it's over and you're still standing. The risk gets taken and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. And either way, you discover that you can tolerate the outcome. Each of these small experiences, these tiny corrections to the old survival program, is a data point, and the nervous system, which runs on data, begins to update. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments. A choice to stop reading the same email for the 5th time and just press send. A decision to say yes to something before you've considered every way it could go wrong. An afternoon where you notice the overthinking starting and you do something with your hands instead of following the thought. You cook something. You walk somewhere. You call someone, not because you've solved the problem in your head, but because you've decided, just this once, to leave the problem unsolved and live your life around it. That is the courage the overthinking brain does not want you to know you have. Because the moment you discover that you can act without certainty, the survival strategy loses its monopoly. And the part of you that has been running the watchtower for decades, the part that believes thinking is the only safe thing to do, that part gets scared. It will escalate. It will throw more what-ifs at you. It will insist that this time is different, that this risk is real, that you need to think about it just a little bit more. And you might listen. You probably will, some of the time. That's okay. This is not about perfection. The overthinker does not need one more thing to be perfect about. This is about the slow, imperfect, courageous process of learning to live a life that your mind has been rehearsing for years, but your body has never actually tried. Your nervous system doesn't believe that yet. Your default mode network is still running the old program. Your amygdala is still calibrated to a world that no longer exists. But brains change. Nervous systems adapt. Patterns that were learned can be unlearned. And the 73% of young adults who overthink becomes 20% by the time they're older, which means most people figure this out eventually, not by thinking their way to the answer, by living their way to it. Maybe it's time to find out what that feels like, not through some dramatic moment of transformation, not through a retreat or a breakthrough session, or a single conversation that changes everything. Through the accumulation of small, imperfect, slightly terrifying actions that teach your nervous system a new truth, one experience at a time. Through the willingness to do it badly, to do it scared, to do it without being ready. Because readiness, for the overthinker, is the finish line that keeps moving. And at some point, you have to start running before you can see where it is. Gabor Mate once said that trauma is not what happened to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. What happened inside you was the construction of a brilliant, exhausting, life-narrowing system for keeping yourself safe through thought. What can happen inside you now, if you let it, is something different. Not the destruction of that system, because you can't destroy something that saved your life, but the expansion of what's possible around it, the addition of new responses, new tolerances, new capacities, a wider window, a longer pause between the thought and the reaction, a growing trust, fragile at first and then a little sturdier, that you can survive the things your mind insists you cannot. You have been thinking about living for a very long time. The invitation, and it is only that, an invitation, not an instruction, is to find out what it feels like to live about living instead. Your brain will have something to say about that. It always does. You don't have to listen.